Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to chat about a topic that's come up recently in the comments in various ways, and that is this: America's inferiority complex with its native classical music tradition, and to a certain extent, the view of America's classical music tradition that others, and particularly in Europe, have. And I'm talking about this based solely on my own personal experience, of course, with my fellow critics and running back and forth internationally and spending a few dozen years in Europe, doing the Cannes Classical Awards and hanging out with the record industry, and also your comments as well, because that's where this came up. And it's really a very interesting topic because the United States has a terrible inferiority complex when it comes to native artists, native composers, native anything that has to do with classical music. So let me make two initial observations. Number one, the classical music enterprise is European. That's where it was invented. That's where it came from. It was Italian and German and French, essentially, and later kind of sort of English, maybe, and elsewhere, Russian and Spanish and, all of those places. But the bases were first Italian and then French and then German, and that all got mixed up. So that's where it comes from. That's what it is. There is no challenging that fact. So that's number one. Number two, musical talent is universal. It may be that if you grow up in a certain culture with a certain emphasis on aspects of the classical music universe, you will have an advantage in getting to know that. But nobody, and I mean nobody, has a birthright to the classical music heritage. You're either musically talented or you're not. And if you are, it doesn't make any difference what kind of music you play or what you're going to do. You've got talent. And if you're not, you're not. And that's the end of that conversation as far as I'm concerned. I am absolutely, totally opposed and disgusted at the automatic claim of cultural superiority by birthright. It does not exist as far as I'm concerned. It exists hugely in the form of European cultural nationalism, about which we hear a lot. But it's bullshit. It's complete bullshit, and that's that. Now, what's the deal with the United States? The deal with the United States is very simple. 99.9% of classical music culture in the United States is European. And I don't mean European because it comes from there. I mean it's European because the people who are doing it are European. Let's consider three different areas. Let's talk about orchestras, and then ensembles, and then composers. And we can see how the American inferiority complex affects all of them, and also what the perception is abroad that I've noticed. It's a very interesting topic. Orchestras, first of all. There is no question, none whatsoever, that in the immediate post-war period, the greatest orchestras in the world were all American. They just were. Why is that? Because Europe had just been through 2 world wars. It was a total mess. And the United States, which fought in both of those wars, still had preserved its European culture. Not only had it preserved its orchestral culture, but all of the best conductors were here. All of them, practically without exception, except for Furtwängler. Controversial pick anyway, but most of the rest of them were here. Toscanini was here. We had Reiner. We had Zell. We had Beecham. We had all of even the lesser ones. We had Kusevitsky. We had Munch. We had Monteux. They were all here. Klemperer was here. And composers were here. Stravinsky was here. Schoenberg was here. European culture decamped during the war and came to the United States, which greatly fortified American musical life. I mean, it really, really did. Not only that, but a lot of the players in those orchestras were European because they were friends of the conductors or they had been trained in Europe. And the American musical, institutional, military, industrial complex had not cranked up to its full potential. I mean, Juilliard was around, but the number of new people that conservatories were pumping out was nothing like it is today. And some of those conductors, like Monteux, set up training conservatory type things. I mean, even Juilliard itself and the Mannes School and all those things were founded and established largely by European people, and they were staffed by European artists. So to talk about the distinctive of American musical culture is absolutely pointless. Pointless. It has nothing to do with the United States in and of itself. In the United States, everybody comes from someplace else. Everybody does. And everybody is proud of the someplace else that they come from. And so if you work in the classical music world, your pedigree is going to be European. So to talk about, American orchestras is a weird thing for me. Because yes, they were American. They were American by virtue of location. But were they American in terms of some sort of breeding and culture and something? No, they weren't. And the conductors weren't. The only major conductor who had a major American orchestra was Leonard Bernstein. And that was for about 10 years. And that was it. That was it. Even today, most conductors of most of the major American orchestras come from Europe. That's just the way it's always been. So it's one thing. Classical music culture in the United States and in Europe is one thing. And the only differences are economic, that is, the amount of money that goes into it, and the kind of training and technical proficiency that they have by virtue of their longevity and stability. I mean, if you're going to have two major world wars within a couple of decades, and everyone's called to fight and your orchestras are getting decimated, well, what do you expect? So, and for some reason, Europe has never forgiven Americans for having great orchestras when Europe was going down the crapper. And that's a shame, but that's Europe's problem. That's not our problem. I'll never forget seeing gramophone reviews or the Penguin Guide people talking about, the technical, American slickness of American orchestras. And I always thought to myself, well, first of all, that's why all of the Hollywood studios recorded like Star Wars with the London Symphony, because they didn't want that Hollywood slickness, right? Yeah, of course, they went to Europe to get that. Why? Because they were cheaper. That was the reason. But the Hollywood sound is as much a European phenomenon as it is an American phenomenon. Hell, most of the composers in Hollywood were European. I mean, the distinction is a stupid one, and it's a pointless one artistically. It has something to do with nationalism, nationalist bigotry, if you want to call it that, but nothing to do with musical quality. Musical quality is as it sounds. And we've got the recordings to prove it. The Vienna Philharmonic in the 1950s was not a great orchestra. The Berlin Philharmonic was not a great orchestra by American standards, by the standards of Chicago or Philadelphia or New York or Boston or Cleveland. No. And so that's a fact. It's an audible fact. Doesn't mean they couldn't give great performances, and it couldn't mean that as soon as the war ended and those conductors swooped back over to Europe to take over their orchestras. European orchestras didn't improve amazingly. They did. And by the 1970s, they were as good as anything out there, including the American orchestras. But there was a period, and that period represents the golden age of LP stereo recordings, when American orchestras were the best ones out there. And so I reject people who claim that I have American bias when I praise American orchestras, which are led by European conductors and consist primarily of European personnel and play European repertoire based on European training. I mean, it's just silly. So that's the orchestra thing. Now, let's talk about ensembles. I mean, ensembles are a different matter, because ensembles follow my dictum that talent is what talent is wherever it is. For example, the Juilliard String Quartet, an American string quartet for the most part. Sometimes, I mean, you can bet that their parents weren't American. I mean, Leonard Bernstein's parents weren't American. He happened to have been born in Massachusetts. His parents were from Russia. So Again, the idea of American culture is a little bit weird. But there we're just talking about training. We're talking about training, technical excellence, and the talent of individuals. And there are amazingly talented American musicians who most of the time have their talent recognized in the classical music field in Europe. That's certainly true of singers. When you think about Jesse Norman or Marilyn Horne or the great American singers, they all trained in German opera houses, provincial opera houses in Europe, because there was nothing here for them, nothing whatsoever. So American singers and American instrumentalists, yes, there are absolutely fabulous ones. I mean, when Van Cliburn won the Tchaikovsky competition, it was national news because he was American. But it was national news because it was such an exception. It was so completely, totally unexpected and outrageously out there. And since then, the classical music world has been pretty ecumenical. But still, in order for American artists to get recognition in America, they have to succeed in Europe. Because Americans believe, wrongly, I think, that Europeans have some sort of ability to pick out or accept or ratify or validate their talent in the classical music world. I don't think that's true at all. But what Europe does have is the training facilities. It has all of the subsidized tax-supported municipal orchestras and opera houses and all of it. It has the culture, in other words, whereas America does not, at least not to the same degree or not in the same way. And so artists go to Europe. But that just sort of proves my point, because what matters is not where somebody's born. It doesn't matter if you're French or German or Italian or American or anything. What matters is how you're trained. What matters is your provenance. That's what the classical music world operates on. So-and-so was somebody's teacher who was somebody's teacher who was trained by Liszt, or who goes back to Beethoven, or was a pupil of Joachim. I mean, those are the schools, the great schools of instrumental playing, of performance, of technique. All of that stuff originates in Europe. It goes back to Europe. There are American schools that are sort of getting founded now. They're based in European origins. They had European origins. But for example, there are American schools of brass playing. I mean, the tuba player, the Vienna Philharmonic was American. Was it Gene Pokorny, I think was his name, or something like that? Well, there are, American artists who wind up playing in Europe too. But it's because they operate within that sort of paradigm, within that provenance. So again, to talk about American is silly musically. It's absolutely ridiculous. The American musical culture is not in classical music, is not some sort of classical version of American popular culture. It's European culture. It's as European as anything in Europe. So let's now talk about. So we talked about ensembles, we talked about orchestras and ensembles, and then there's the third thing we need to talk about, which is the giant blue whale in the room, and that's composers. American orchestras and American ensembles generally treat American composers like garbage, and the problem is an institutional one. It's not that there aren't American composers who get played. They get played constantly. Orchestras have composers in residence. They're always pushing contemporary music. I mean, there's tons and tons and tons of outlets. There are organizations and societies that specialize in doing contemporary music. But when people talk about composers, great composers coming from America and whatnot, you're usually talking about American composers who have broken into the classical mainstream, the canon of great classical recordings. It has nothing to do with the amount of musical activity surrounding contemporary music, of which there is tons, just tons of it everywhere, because there are so many conservatory trained students and musicians all looking for work and looking for things to do, and who have friends who are composers. It all works. American composers, to the extent that they need the imprimatur of Europeans, are at a big disadvantage, because Europeans promote their own thing. I've always said that, Americans are patriotic. They love their country. Europeans are nationalists. They hate everyone else's country. And that's what happens in Europe. I mean, it really is. You have these large institutional bodies that support local talent. You don't have that here to the same degree. And then you have to have major artists, the really big artists willing to push for native talent, to break into the classical mainstream. I mean, Charles Ives sort of did it, kind of did it as a result of maybe Leonard Bernstein. He's kind of just now, getting some international play. Gershwin, of course, has always been popular, especially in Russia. And there are a couple of others. Copland gets played once in a while in Europe, but not very much. But then again, European audiences aren't interested in American music. They're interested in the standard classics, just as audiences in America are. Everybody's only interested in the standard classics, not in anything more recent. And to the extent that there are novelties or composers who are appreciated in certain localities, they tend to be native. And that's just the way the universe works. So that means it's up to American orchestras and American ensembles to promote American music to the extent that it breaks through the glass ceiling. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I really don't. I mean, it will happen, if it does, very slowly, very gradually, very incrementally. There are wonderful American composers. But my point about them isn't that Europeans should be acknowledging them. I don't give a damn what Europeans want. What I care about is that Americans should acknowledge them. Americans should be open, more open than they are to allowing, the best of those composers to be performed. And there have been American conductors who've been very good at that. Leonard Slatkin, what would we do without him? Who has always promoted the American composers, American musical culture, the more conservative American composers who have some audience appeal. Walter Piston, Samuel Barber. It may not be the avant-garde, but it's American. Of course, Piston was actually Italian. His real name was Pistone, but what the heck, or something like that. Whatever his real name was, his parents were Italian. He was Italian. It's so funny to just see the way that the politics of musical culture, the nationalistic element, colors people's perceptions. And in a really sort of bad way. I think it's a tragedy that American composers don't get more support from American orchestras on a regular basis, not just, oh, here's a novelty we're going to do in American work. They should be promoted and performed and become part of our regular musical diet. And if that happens for long enough, and if the music is good enough, quite frankly, and a lot of it is, it will become part of our local musical culture, which I think is a lovely thing. And there may be at some point some kind of American musical culture. One of the reasons that American classical music culture has been so slow to take shape is that American musical culture is largely based on popular music. It's based on pop music, rock music, jazz, and what Dvorak said back in the 1890s, based on indigenous music and the music of African-American immigrants. And so, yes, there is an American musical culture. It's Florence Price. It's William Grant Still. It's also Don Gillis. It's very enjoyable. It's wonderful, wonderful music. It was, of course, spat upon by the American avant-garde, which was doing its best to out-European the European avant-garde, the Darmstadt crowd, and all of that foolishness. And so what had the opportunity, the chance to become the genuine American classical music culture has always been disparaged by the institutional American classical music culture. That may be changing a little bit. I think that's a totally healthy thing. I did a talk already on, what's wrong with woke programming that some people screamed and yelled about. But the fact of the matter is, if it helps American audiences get in touch with their American roots because they're American, then it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. So these are just some thoughts about, America's inferiority complex when it comes to its classical music heritage, what it really is, why Americans are always falsely and unfortunately looking to Europe for validation, which we don't need. We've never needed it, because all you need to be able to do is recognize musical talent wherever you hear it. And if you keep on listening, and if you understand and appreciate talent wherever it arises, then you will have your own indigenous musical culture based on indigenous musical talent and the recognition thereof. All the rest of it is just silliness. It really is, as far as I'm concerned. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.